For more problems and videos like this for linear algebra, you can take a look at Sarai Studies. Link is in the description box below. We start with our leftmost non-zero column. That's this one. Our pivot position is at the top. The goal is to get everything below that pivot position to be 0. So we want to kill all of these entries. In other words, make them 0. So the first one is -4. We want to kill something that is in row 2. We want to use whatever's inside our pivot position to do so. My pivot position is in row 1. Then I add whatever's here, that's row 2. And to find out how I can manipulate this so that this here becomes 0, I write down these rows down here and I'm adding them. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this to become a 0. That's the first entry in a row. So first entry here should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I do so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this here would have to be a 4, because 4 minus 4 will be 0. But how can I get this to be a 4? I would multiply by 4. But whatever I do to one entry in a row, I have to do to the rest of the entries in that same row, which is why we take the entirety of row 1 and multiply by 4. This becomes 4, this becomes 12, and then zeros really don't matter. Then we can just add. -4 is 0, just like we wanted it to be. This is 0 plus 3 is 3. This is 7 and this is 2. And this here is my new row 2. So since the only row I'm changing is row 2, these first row and third row stay the same. And then my row 2 becomes my new row 2, which is this one right here. This is still my pivot position and I still need to make sure everything below it's 0. So the next thing to kill is this 3. I want to kill something that is in row 3. I want to use whatever's in my pivot position to do so. My pivot position is in row 1. Then my equation becomes plus whatever's here, that's row 3. To find out how I can manipulate this so that this becomes 0, I write down these rows. Then I'm adding. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this first entry in this row to be 0. The first entry here should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I do so that this plus this is going to give me 0? Well, this would have to be a -3. How do I get that to be a -3? I would have to multiply by -3, but whatever I do to one entry in a row, I have to do to the rest of the entries in that same row. So I take the entirety of row 1 and multiply it by -3. That way this becomes a -3, this becomes a -9, and then zeros really don't matter. Then I add like I said I was. 3 minus 3, 0, just like we wanted it to be. This becomes -1, this becomes -5, and then this becomes -2, and this here is my new row 3. Since the only row I'm changing is row 3, these two rows stay the same, and my row 3 is going to become my new row 3, which is this one right here. This is still my pivot position, but everything below it is 0, so we did our job. And it's the same thing. You want to make sure you clear everything at the bottom of those pivots. But, tip and trick, I know you don't have to have these be 1s for row echelon form, but if we're going to go and put this in reduced row echelon form anyway, we might as well make them a 1. And it's also going to actually help us. So to get this to be a 1, well, I'm going to change something in row 2, and I would just have to divide by 3, right? But whatever I do to one thing, I have to do to the rest of them in the entire row. I would take row 2 and divide by 3. That would become my new row 2. So that'd be 0, 1, 7 divided by 3, 2 divided by 3. Now this is still my pivot position and I want to clear everything below it. So I'm going to kill this -1. So that -1 is in row 3. So I want to kill something in row 3. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position to do so. That pivot position is in row 2. Then my equation becomes plus whatever's here, that's row 3. Then to find out what I need to do to manipulate this equation so that this becomes a 0, I write these rows down here. So row 2 and then row 3. Then I'm adding. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this first, second entry here to be 0. So first, second entry here should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I do so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, nothing, because it already does. 1 minus 1 gives me 0. So I don't have to change anything here. I can just do the adding. So this is 0. This is 3, 7, 15. That's -8 divided by 3. Then 2/3 minus 2. So common denominator 3. 2 minus 6. -4 divided by 3. This here is my new row 3. So since the only row I changed was row 3, these two top rows are going to stay the same. And this row 3 is going to become my new row 3, which is that one over here. Now this is still my pivot position. I managed to clear out everything below it. So then once I do that, I can clear out the row and column and focus on the remaining submatrix formed when I did that. And that's this one right here. Pivot position is at the top. As soon as you get to a pivot position, you want to make it a 1 just to make your life easier. So how do I do that? Well, if I have a -8 over 3, then I would just do 3 over 8, make it a negative. That way these cancel out and we're left with 1. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of them in that same row. So this is in row 3. So I'm going to take row 3 and multiply by -3/8. And then we have -4 divided by 3 times -3/8. So the answer is going to be positive, and then these cancel out. We're left with 4 divided by 8, which is 1 divided by 2. So positive 1/2. Now just cleaning things up a little bit. Then your goal is to get everything below it to be 0, but there's nothing below it. Then you're done with that pivot, so you cross out row and column, and then you move on to the remaining submatrix form, but there is no submatrix form because you literally just crossed out everything. So you're done. Now you just work backwards. Now you go up and to the left. So now you want to make sure that everything above that 1 is 0. So I want to kill this one next. The thing that I want to kill is in row 2. So I want to kill something that's in row 2. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position that's in row 3 to do so. Then my equation becomes plus whatever is here, which is row 2. And then to find out how I can manipulate this so that this becomes 0, I write these 2 rows here because it helps me see things, and I write it in the order that matrix is in. So row 2 comes before row 3. Then I'm adding, and then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this first, second, third entry to be 0. So here, first, second, third entry should be 0. Then I focus on this column. I ask myself, what can I do so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be a negative 7/3. How do I get this one to be a negative 7/3? I would just multiply by that. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of the entries in that same row. Take the entire row 3 and multiply by negative 7/3. And this becomes negative 7/3. We have 1/2 times negative 7/3. That's 7/6, and it's negative. So we have negative 7 divided by 6. And now we just add. So 0 plus 0 is 0. This is 1. This is what I wanted it to be, 0. And then we have 2/3 plus negative 7/6. Common denominator is 6. 3 goes into 6 2 times. So 2 times 2, that's 4. 6 go into 6 1 time. So it's just 7. Then we have negative 3 divided by 6, which is negative 1/2. And this is my new row 2. So since the only row I'm changing is row 2, this first and third row stay the same. And my row 2 is going to be replaced with my new row 2 over here. So we're still at this pivot. So we start at the last pivot that we were working with, and we have to make sure that everything is cleared. So then it comes to this 3 that we want to kill. So we want to kill this 3 that's in row 1. So I want to kill something in row 1. I want to use whatever's inside my pivot position to do so. We're still here, so that pivot position is in row 3. Then plus whatever you see here, that's row 1. To find out what I need to do to manipulate this equation so that this becomes a 0, I help myself by writing these rows down here in the order that they are in the matrix. So row 1 comes before row 3. Then I'm adding because I said I was adding. Then I ask myself, what's my goal? My goal is for this first, second, third entry to be 0. So this first, second, third entry should be 0. Then I focus on this column and I ask myself, what can I do so that this plus this gives me 0? Well, this would have to be a minus 3. How do I get it to be a minus 3? I would multiply by negative 3. But whatever I do to one entry, I have to do to the rest of the entries in that same row. So I'm going to take row 3. I'm going to multiply by negative 3. So now this becomes negative 3 and this becomes negative 3/2. And then I just add. So now it's 1, 0. This is what I wanted it to be, 0. And then here we have negative 3/2, and this is my new row 1. So since the only row I'm changing is row 1, then these 2 rows should stay the same, and my row 1 is going to become my new row 1 over here. So here I still have this pivot position. I made sure that everything above it is 0. Then we move on to the next pivot position. Everything above it is 0. Then the next, there's nothing above it. So we're done. This is all ready in reduced row echelon form. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next.